in a free country, or how you think. It's a free country. Do what the hell you want. Right? There's religious ben, which is what I think is sinful, which is Jews who violate Sabbath, right? Jews who eat shellfish, right? There's a lot of things that we think are sinful in Judaism, right? And then there's the stuff where do what you want because it's a free country. I think people do a lot of sinful stuff all the time, and I'm not calling them on it, right? I think that people who are living together outside of marriage are sinning according to my traditional religious beliefs. It's a free country. Do what you want. So when people say homophobia, I think what they are doing is saying you disagree with me. I've never called for violence, and not only that, I'm in favor of legalization of same-sex marriage in the sense I want the government completely out of marriage, right? I don't want the government in the marriage business at all. So it's very...
Whatever you do not hit that button.
Bobby, we cannot.
Well, it is a controversial topic on a Toronto University campus this month. Some people on the campus say pronouns like he, she, him, or her do not represent them accurately. Now, the university wants staff to use alternate pronouns, but Jordan Peterson is a psychology professor at the university, and he is refusing to do that. Take a look at this.
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis. I'm speaking out the way I'm speaking out because I think this is a route to no violence. And violence is lurking, and you can say that that sounds like a threat.
There was no violence at our protest, though.
I have asked what you refer to me if it wasn't for this law, and I asked you to refer to me with they, them pronouns, would you? And your answer was no.
Not if it was repelled.
No.
So just an example of how things have become heated at the University of Toronto. That scene showing different groups of students, some confronting the professor about his position, others supporting him. Now, Peterson says this is about free speech, but A.W. Pete is also a professor at the University of Toronto who says that Peterson's language is abusive. Joining us right now is Professor Jordan Peterson, as well as Professor A.W. Pete. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate
No.
pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Well, we have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z or Zin, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or A rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there. Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. In New Zealand, where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice. So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. It's a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation foresaw. So in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities, and I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. Absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Sorry, excuse me for jumping in, but I want to bring in Professor Pete here because we did show those words to our audience at home, and perhaps the controller can show it to our audience once again. When you look at those alternate pronouns, I think it's fair to say that some people will see that at home and see that as very unwieldy, if you will. What do you say to those types of criticisms, including the one you just heard from Professor Peterson?
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. You know, we call somebody what they want to be called in our society. For instance, I don't call somebody Julie if they prefer to be called Jordan. That's just basic human courtesy. Here's a great little tip for people who are despairing at the possibility of remembering all those pronouns. What I do is just program in the pronoun next to the person's name in my smartphone. So whenever I'm out and about and I've forgotten whether one of my trans friends uses Z or Zer or they or them or something else, I just look it up and it's really super easy. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people. It's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson. So, we should have people learning to listen more. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very good reason. When things get political, I like to ask who benefits and who gets to decide the rules of the game. So, mostly with this Peterson controversy, which is really just a small drama, a tempest in a teapot, he could just get over learning to program a few pronouns into his phone. By the way, I only have half a dozen or so that I actually use on an everyday basis, so it's not all that difficult.
Professor Peterson, Professor Peterson, good job, because I think Professor Peterson wants to get in on that.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all. So, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely in case we offend someone.
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't remember people's first names very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you being lazy, Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice, am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month. For example, have you recently had a bank employee accuse you of trying to masquerade as yourself at a bank and then locking down your ATM card and credit card so that you can't use any money? Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, considering suicide. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
They
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
untransphobic.
They
Just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked
I
to a
didn't
few
know
trans
them.
people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm
trans-
sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right, so the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected
they're
you
noisy.
either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, and on behalf of other people, perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, and so I'm not taking.
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use
Not
anymore.
by
to describe-
legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether
I just said
legislated or
how
not?
it was different.
I understand.
Legislation is how it's different.
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect.
Professor Pete, I want to ask you, because it's been brought up a couple of times, to Professor Peterson's point, if this was so popular, if this was so needed, there would be a natural evolution. There wouldn't be need for legislation. Why the need for legislating this as opposed to allowing it to evolve naturally?
Well, Bill C-16 and the Ontario Human Rights Code do not actually legislate pronoun usage. They don't specify 31 genders or anything of the kind.
But let me jump in, though. The university is essentially telling, at this point, its human resources people to use alternate pronouns, in a way legislating their staff to do this.
No, wait, the legislation also requires that the university made clear their concordance with that assumption on my part by mentioning in the letter that asked me to silence myself that I'm required to act in accordance with the provisions of the Ontario Human Rights Act. And so the university knows full well that the legislation does precisely what I suggest it does. It's not written precisely in Bill C-16, it's written in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And if you read the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies on such things, you'll see very rapidly that utilization of preferred pronouns is part of the legislative package. So
And
that's
they're
just
actually,
that's
if you read the
disingenuous.
legislation, Jordan, you will find out that they're actually called correct pronouns. There's no preference about this.
There is
It's
on the
about
Ontario.
what's
There is on
correct
the
for a
Ontario.
person.
There is on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website where the policy's laid out. And if people don't believe that, they can just go look themselves.
Professor Pete, when you hear that this is a free speech issue, that you hear Professor Peterson in this case essentially saying that he doesn't want to be legislated to adopt new language, what's your response to that?
Well, I share a number of Jordan's concerns about freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus. These are both very, very important principles, and they should apply regardless of what kind of politics you like. For example, if you're a left-winger or a right-winger or an up-winger or a down-winger or whatever it is. But you know, the reason why we have laws that protect academic freedom and freedom of speech is primarily to prevent government interference in individuals' lives, in their business. It's there really mostly to protect against a form of structural violence. And these free speech laws were actually never intended to be used as all-purpose accountability shields, you know, so that you don't have to be held accountable for your actions.
I'm perfectly willing to be held accountable for my actions, and the university has already indicated the seriousness with which they view my actions. And I also do not believe that free speech laws were there to protect, to regulate violence. Free speech laws are there because we use free speech to identify problems in our society, generate solutions to the problems, and then reach a consensus. So freedom of speech is actually is protection for the mechanism by which our individuals and society properly orient themselves across time. It's not even a principle, it's the fundamental method by which our societies manage to maintain the stability that they do maintain. And so
It's one of the ways we do that, yes.
Well, I would say that it's the fundamental way. So, and I mean, I think we could have a reasonable discussion about that, but because freedom of speech is so tightly tangled up with the means by which we solve problems, I mean, I think, you know, and then I talk, but I get corrected when I speak publicly, and the fact that I'm being corrected constantly by the people that I'm speaking with helps orient my speech properly and helps orient public discussion properly. And I can tell you, too, that if there wasn't something absolutely vital at stake here that had a lot more to do than with just simple kindness, there wouldn't have been millions of people watching, for example, the assault that took place during the free speech rally that was held a few days after I released the video, which I see that CBC conveniently omitted to include in their video clips at the beginning of this interview.
Well, Professor Peterson, we do want to thank you. We're sorry we're out of time here, but I want to thank both of you for joining us today. That is the University of Toronto Professors Jordan Peterson and A.W. Pete, talking about what has become a very big controversy at the University of Toronto and beyond.
Perfect marksman.
I used to crush at this game, shooting $5 in a row to get perfect marksman and winning $5 doing it.
What's in a name? Potentially a great deal. University of Toronto psychology professor Jordan Peterson has a fight on his hands after objecting to proposed legislation that he says would violate his freedom of speech by forcing him to address transgender people using the pronouns of their choosing. Joining us now to better understand the issue and debate what's at stake, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Theron Meyer, transgender pundit and YouTuber. In the nation's capital, Kyle Kirkup, professor of law at the University of Ottawa. And here in studio, the aforementioned Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology, University of Toronto, Nicholas Matt, lecturer in transgender studies at U of T, and Mary Rogan, whose article entitled Growing Up Trans is featured in the October issue of the Walrus magazine. Good to have you three here and our two friends in Points Beyond. We appreciate everybody being on the program for what is, I think, one of the hottest topics in the country today, Professor Peterson, and it's all because of you. And I think before we go any further with our conversation here, I want to give people a sense of how hot this has got, starting on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto. Chilton, if you would, roll it.
Okay. Well, as you can see, the opponents of free speech are capable of making a lot of inarticulate noise. Free speech, the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning. And by doing this, you're imposing.
I'm going to post this online that you would like people to be more accommodating of trans people and people of color at your events in future.
I would like there to be no violence.
determine whether or not an individual is worthy of you using their pronouns. Like if I asked you, would you please use they them pronouns for me? What?
It would depend on what I thought of your
Hoops do you want us to jump through?
Those are my pronouns.
Okay, with indulgence of everybody else on the program, I'm going to start with Professor Peterson off the top here for a while because, as I suggested, you thought long and hard about this. You posted a few things up to YouTube because you had been thinking long and hard about it. 1.5 million hits later, Jordan, 1.5 million hits later, this has become a huge issue. So let's start there. Why did you post those views to YouTube in the first place?
Well, there's proximate and distal reasons. The proximate reasons was because I received some correspondence from clients of mine who had been, I would say, persecuted in a variety of ways by people who were politically correct, and they sent me some documentation about Bill C-16 and the associated policy statements on the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which I read and was not very happy about. And also because the University of Toronto decided to make anti-racism and anti-bias training, so-called anti-racism and anti-bias training, because of issues, fundamental issues of confidentiality.
Essentially, I guess what I'm asking is to lay the case out. What is it you find offensive about this legislation?
Well, fundamentally, there were two things that really bothered me, although there have been other things I've thought about since. One was that I was being asked, as everyone is, to use a certain set of words that I think are the constructions of people who have a political ideology that I don't believe in and that I also regard as dangerous.
What are those words?
Those are the made-up words that people now describe as gender neutral. And so, to me, they're an attempt to control language and in a direction that isn't happening organically. It's not happening naturally. People aren't picking up these words in the typical way that new words are picked up, but by force and by fiat. And I would say by force because there's legislative power behind them. So and I don't like these made-up words, Z and Zer and that sort of thing.
What about, they're not all made-up words, quote-unquote made-up words. For example, they is one of them.
Yeah, but
we speak to an individual as they.
Right, but we can't dispense with the distinction between singular and plural. I mean, I know that the advocates of that particular approach say that they has been used forever as a singular, and that's actually not correct. It's used as a singular in very exceptional circumstances, like if your child wishes to bring a book to school, they're welcome to do so. But
that's just grammatically incorrect.
Well, it is also, there's some debate about that, because they is used like that sometimes. But it's never been used as a singular replacement for he or she. And so it's not a tenable solution, and that's the best of the solutions.
So we understand your views and where you're coming from. You decided to lay these views out in some YouTube discourses.
Yes.
You put them up. The response has been overwhelming. Did you anticipate that you would get this kind of feedback?
No, there was no way of anticipating this. And I think you mentioned in the intro, that this is a consequence of what I've done. And I don't think that's true. It's a consequence of the fact. I thought about it, and I think the right metaphor is that, there's a large forest, and it's been a hot, dry summer, or maybe a drought, and there's plenty of deadwood gathered, and I lit a spark. And you can't blame the forest fire on the spark. And, it's just not possible for someone to put up a YouTube video and cause this kind of brouhaha without all of the groundwork already being laid.
Fair enough. There is clearly there is out there an appetite against political correctness, which is what you have described this as. In fact, your YouTube video is called Professor Against Political Correctness. But let's make sure we're all speaking the same language here. You would define that how? Political correctness.
Well, I think it's a particular kind of ideological game, and I think the outcome is twofold. It's to make the player feel morally superior, and also to take rather serious axe swings at the foundation of society. And so the game is identify a domain of human endeavor, note that there's a distribution of success. Some people are doing comparatively better and some people are doing comparatively worse. Define those doing worse as victims. Define those doing better as perpetrators. Identify with the victims. Have yourself a set of enemies handy to vent your resentment on. Feel good about it, even though it didn't really require any work on your part, and then endlessly repeat. And that's why I've seen that happening on campuses in particular for the last 30 years.
In your YouTube talk, you describe those who oppose you on this issue as, quote, resentful and uninformed.
Yes.
Tell me why you think that's accurate.
Well, I worked for the NDP when I was a kid. From the time I was 14 to the time I was 18, I worked with Rachel Notley's father and her mother, and knew them very well. And I actually found them very admirable people, as well as the other people on the socialist end of the distribution who were genuinely working for the rights of working class people, coming out of that Saskatchewan tradition that established health care and pension and all of that. But I noted at the same time that the party functionaries, let's say, weren't that sort of person at all. They didn't really like the working class. They weren't standing up for them. I can't quite put my finger on it until I read George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier, which is a brilliant book, and which was written for the Left Book Club in the UK. And he was talking about the failures of socialism in the United Kingdom, and then discussed intellectual socialists of the type who didn't exactly like the poor. They just hated the rich.
Resentful and uninformed, though.
Yes, well, the resentful part is the willingness to pull down any structure that's hierarchical because of resentment about not being on the top. And uninformed is, well, it's the consistent attempt to force every political issue into into the domain encompassed and viewed through this single lens.
Jordan, let's do one more question here, and then we'll get everybody else into the conversation. You know, of course, that since this story broke, you've been called a lot of things.
Yeah.
One of which is a transphobe.
Yeah.
Some people have accused you of using the free speech issue to mask what's really going on here, which is an attempt to deprive other people of what they believe are their legitimate rights.
Well,
and I want to give you the opportunity to speak to whether or not you are a transphobe.
Well, I can tell you that I've received more letters from transsexual people supporting me than opposing me. And I never said anything really about transsexual people, about their existence, although that was the first thing that I was accused of doing. I didn't say that transsexual people didn't exist. I said that gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex do not vary independently, which they don't. And so this issue is in some sense only peripherally about transsexual issues. It's more essentially about gender issues, and then on top of that, and I think it's the biggest issue, is that it's a free speech issue.
Okay, so let's continue to explore all of those issues that you have just raised, and why don't we do this? Let's take a moment. We're going to explain a few basic things here. The issue of so-called non-traditional pronouns goes together with non-traditional gender identities. New York City, for example, recognizes 31 such gender expressions. In other words, besides man and woman, there are 29 other gender expressions. For example, pangender, queer gender, gender fluid, cross-dresser, bi-gendered, gender blender, and the list goes on. And Nicholas, this is where I want to bring you into the discussion because you teach this, you teach trans studies. So if you would, give us a brief primer on so many gender identities that in your view require non-traditional pronouns.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex, and I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception. So essentially, in my transgender studies classes, what we're doing is looking at actual research and identifying ways that current social issues related to trans people or things that are associated with trans, such as free speech arguments and claims, how that connects to the way that people are thinking, the way that research has been framed, the history of
Give us some of the other pronouns that one would hear, typically.
I don't focus on pronouns because pronouns are actually part of a cis-normative culture. So what we do is learn about...
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah, I was just about to explain.
Good.
So we don't start from a cis-normative perspective because that can't actually go very far.
What does cis-normative mean?
So I'm going to start us there. Cis-normative is basically a very popular idea and assumption that most people probably have, and definitely that our structures convey, that there is such a thing as male and female, that they connect to being a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, and then sometimes that will also recognize intersex or trans people or transsexual people, as you mentioned, because that's sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. So anything that fits within a gender binary can work within cis-normativity.
Okay.
But cis-normativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female, and so very little is actually looked at to understand what's actually the case. And scientists have been doing this for
Because
at
your
least
view
over
would be
50 years.
your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true, and yet our social systems haven't been able to find a way to address the level of complexity that people actually experience.
And Steve, stand by for a second, because I want to let everybody else get in first.
And I
then
don't
we'll get
interrupt you either, so.
Mary, how prevalent is transgenderism in our world?
I don't think I can. I don't think I can answer that question. I think that I would agree with Nicholas that there is some discrepancy on these numbers, and there is some variance on the numbers. I guess I'm curious as to why we need to put a number on this, because that's come up. I listened to Jordan's video, and that was something that was mentioned. You know, this is statistically, you know, there are so few intersex people as to be, it's insignificant.
There's a reasonable curiosity as to whether or not we're talking about half the population or less than 1% of the population. That's all.
No, I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is, it seems that there's a focus on that in terms of what we know now, and I think what Nicholas is trying to say, and I don't want to presume too much. I think that number is going to be something that evolves as we evolve and our language evolves, and we give people the room to come forward and express who they are.
Okay, let me, as part of that expression and evolution of this issue, the use of non-traditional pronouns. Where are you on that?
I think people should be able to say how they want to be addressed. I do believe that. In my own experience in writing the Walrus piece, you know, I began at one place and ended at another. And I'll let everyone pay their $7 to find out how they can buy the magazine. But I think that for me, you know, identifying as male at a very late stage in my life, I didn't have a lot of attachment to the pronoun she. You could have said giraffe. I had found a way at a very early age not to even hear that word. It meant nothing to me. So I didn't dive into the pronoun he.
So if I were going to refer to you, though, in the third
They.
person, you
They.
would want me to call you they?
Yes.
Okay, because that encapsulates it.
I think it reflects where I am right now. I because of my lived experience, you know, 5 decades as being identified, certainly by the world as female, some of the time, not all of the time. My lived experience is largely female, and I personally am not sort of ready to jump in wholly into having people call me he. But I'm certainly far enough along in terms of, you know, how I feel internally that I don't want to be called she.
What?
Understood. Let's go to British Columbia.
Well done.
Theron, I want you to help us understand, for our viewers who don't know you and don't know your work, I would like you to describe yourself.
Well, I make political commentary mostly on YouTube, and I mostly focus on basically countering with my own personal perspectives, countering what I consider to be the kind of hegemony surrounding the political hegemony surrounding trans politics, and what I consider to be quite ridiculous opinions and demands coming from what has come to be known as the kind of the political trans lobby.
I'm not as good at this issue as I should be, so I'm going to look to you to help me use the right words here to describe how you were born and what you see yourself as now. So is it accurate to say you're a trans woman?
Yes, I wish I lived in a world where that was just obvious and I don't have to explain that to people, but apparently I do. I mean, yes, I'm just a woman.
Is this to say you were born male but now are female?
Yes, I transitioned from male to female.
In which case, do I refer to you, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mary, which is, do I refer to you as her or she now?
Yes, you do.
I do, okay. And how do you relate to the experiences that we have heard arise during this debate, where gender identities and pronouns are up for grabs, if you like?
I'm very skeptical of the ideology surrounding gender identity. I don't believe there are 29 gender identities or genders. I believe there's male and female, and then there's somewhere in between, and most people fall along that. And just people who are in between does not constitute a new gender. There are two genders, period. and that is biologically a sound argument to make, just because the argument that was made earlier in the show is that, or it wasn't an argument, but a claim that there is no such thing as biological sex. Well, that's simply not true. It is true that there are multiple characteristics and there are multiple factors that go into determining sex, and that sex is not an on-off switch, that there is a spectrum to it, just like with most things in nature. Most things are not on a switch, most things develop on a spectrum. But for the most part, the vast majority of people fall either on the male side or on the female side. And yes, it's true that doctors have research finding more and more factors that go into genetic sex that determine the expression of those genes. So it's truly a fascinating, complex field of study, but that does not mean that there is no such thing as biological sex.
Okay.
When it comes to the issue of pronouns, would you like me to?
Yeah, briefly, if you would, because Kyle has been the most patient person in the world waiting for his chance to get in. So, yes, you finish your statement, and then I'm going to get to Kyle.
Okay, my apologies. Well, firstly, I have a lot of sympathy for people who want to be referred to by their pronouns. Obviously, as a trans woman, I know what it feels like to be misgendered and whatnot. Most people are reasonable in the sense that they would be reasonable enough to accommodate trans people and their preferred pronouns. And I'm sure, I would hope that if I were a student of Dr. Peterson, that he would refer to me as she and wouldn't have a problem with that. But at the end of the day, personal pronoun preference still is a preference for what language other people use. And at the end of the day, I don't have ultimate control over what Dr. Peterson, what the language he chooses to use, or anybody else for that matter. That's up to them.
Okay, let me find out then. Let me find out. If she were a student of yours, what would you call her? She. You would. Okay. We've established that. Theron, stand by for a second now. I do want, thank you for your patience, Professor Kirkup, and I want to bring you in now because as I suggested earlier, in New York City, they have identified 31 gender identities, and apparently the law down there suggests that if businesses don't accommodate an individual's chosen gender identity, there is the risk of a six-figure fine under the rules of the city's Commissioner of Human Rights. We have in the province of Ontario our own Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I wonder how similar our legislation is here on this issue compared to what they have in New York City.
So where I would start the discussion is to actually point that, even though we're talking about adding gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and provisions of the Criminal Code, this is a long-standing practice in Canadian human rights jurisprudence. You can go back into the late 1990s, and the cases that we're seeing in the tribunals are not the kind of extreme examples of a number of different kinds of gender pronouns. What we're seeing is really more basic human rights questions. So questions like, are you required to undergo surgery in order to have an identity document that properly captures who you are as a person? Discrimination in policing contexts, discrimination in the workplace. And so I think the pronoun issue is really a red herring. When you look through the jurisprudence dating back to the 1990s, we're seeing much more fundamental questions, really basic human rights questions that are coming before the tribunals. And having reviewed the case law, I'm not seeing the kind of New York scenario that you're proposing at all.
Well, let me read some of the Ontario Human Rights Code to you, and then I'll get your feedback on that. Discrimination, the Human Rights Code says, happens when a person experiences negative treatment or impact, intentional or not, because of their gender identity or gender expression. It can be direct and obvious, or subtle and hidden, but harmful just the same. It can also happen on a bigger systemic level, such as organizational rules or policies that look neutral but end up excluding trans people. Organizations are liable for any discrimination and harassment that happens. They are also liable for not accommodating a trans person's needs unless it would cause undue hardship. And again, Kyle, I'll get you to follow up on that, in as much as if a trans person or somebody whose gender identity was more, shall we say, complicated than the male-female that we've been talking about so far, and the pronoun used to describe that person were not traditional, would the person have a case before the Human Rights Commission?
So we haven't seen cases on that at this point, but I would say absolutely as a general rule that you should be thinking about in terms of employment settings, absolutely respecting trans persons, pronoun choice is really fundamental. And I can also say that in lots of circumstances, a pronoun may not even be required. There are lots of creative ways to avoid using gendered pronouns at all. And so I think that, but when you actually look at the cases that are coming before tribunals, we're not seeing that to be really the primary issue. It's much more basic human rights questions, which is what the federal legislation here, Bill C-16, tries to accomplish.
All right, I think we've set the table now. You want to get in on this now, I can tell. You've heard what the professor has to say. What's your response?
Well, I don't understand what the claim that there's no such thing as biological sex means, and I certainly think it's, let's call it an error to suggest that there's some sort of scientific consensus about that. I mean, there's biological differences between males and females in animals and human beings at every level of analysis. From them.
I'm jumping in here.
Yeah.
Because what about the notion he put forward at the end there, that if you do not refer to people with the pronoun that they prefer to be referred to, that is a form, according to the Human Rights Commission, of discrimination?
It's not just a form of discrimination, it's a form of hate speech. That's why I made the video. I said that we were in danger of placing the refusal to use certain kinds of language into the same category as Holocaust denial, and suggested that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, especially since there's plenty of debate to be had about gender issues in our society, which I also think are also in danger of becoming illegal, and quite rapidly. So it isn't clear to me how long we'll be able to have the talk that we're having right now.
Here are some...
Can I jump in there? Can I jump in there on, please? Look, I think that's a common misconception about Bill C-16, that it's somehow going to make pronoun use into hate speech. If you actually look at the provisions, we're talking about very minor amendments to the criminal code. For
They're
example,
not minor.
section...
They put it into the hate speech category. They're not minor at all. That's a misstatement.
On that point, I think
So
there's
don't
a
tell
lot
me
of
they're minor.
opportunity here.
That's not
There's
right.
a lot of opportunity.
So section...
Kyle,
Yeah, so section 318, pardon me, so section 318 sets out a series of identifiable groups, and we're talking about the clearest of cases, the cases of advocating genocide. And we have a series of groups that are already identified in the code, and all this does is add gender identity and gender expression to the categories that are already identified. And so I think we really have to add some reasonableness to this discussion, actually clearly articulate what the provision does.
Well, let me be a little clear about what some of the problems, what you might be asking for if you want to do this. For example, and Sheldon, bottom of page 3 here, let's put this graphic up. Pronoun misuse may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and the courts, and the remedies, monetary damages, non-financial remedies, for example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to the job, and public interest remedies, for example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what?
And what? And let's talk about the legalities for a minute. As you know, the University of Toronto sent me 2 warning letters, right? And the second one basically asked me to stop talking about this.
Who sent the letters?
The first, it's the administration, fundamentally, the higher up people in the administration. The last one was the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. But, you know, it's coming from the top end of the university.
And the letter said essentially you must call people by the pronouns they want?
The letters basically said that, and this is paraphrasing obviously, that as I'm required to abide by the university policies and the Ontario Human Rights Code, and there's a strong implication in the letter by having this discussion that I wasn't doing so, and so they're asking me to stop, and I can tell you also why they're asking me to stop. Apart from that, the codes as written make the university just as liable for my speech as I am. So not only is there a reasonable possibility that what I'm doing is uttering hate speech now under our law, but the university is legally responsible for that. And so I think they consulted with their lawyers and decided that maybe the claim that I was making in my video was correct. That So I don't regard that as trivial, and I think that the lawyer who's discussing this is downplaying the significance of it tremendously.
Could I speak to the campus climate about this? Because I don't agree with why Dr. Peterson has been asked to stop abusing students on campus.
To stop doing what?
Abusing students
I see.
and other members of our learning community who do deserve respect and do deserve to be able to work and learn and contribute to society in a place where if they are physically assaulted, if they are
The assault so far came from the social justice warriors who were at this free speech rally. Almost 2 million people have
this is
watched
not
this so
accurate.
far.
This is not accurate.
Well, you can look
are
at the
being
videos
actioned
yourself.
because people have been making complaints about your behavior.
Yes, I understand that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing a greater opportunity for social justice happening that many people won't understand.
Nick, can I be clear on something? You've accused him of abusing students by not using the pronouns that need to be addressed
That's
by.
how I see it, absolutely.
That is tantamount to abuse in your view.
Absolutely. Many global documents, many
Violence.
organizations.
Is it tantamount to violence?
Yes,
How about hate
absolutely.
speech? Is it tantamount to hate
Yes,
speech?
of course, it's hate speech
Fine,
to tell
that's-
someone that you won't refer to them as in a way that they that recognizes their humanity and dignity.
Mary, let me get you in on this at this point.
Sure.
You got something to say, or can I put a question to you?
Both. Go ahead.
Okay.
For the question.
You're a writer, Mary.
I am.
I know you care about free speech because you're a writer.
Yes.
Does Jordan Peterson have a little place in your heart because he's arguing free speech here?
I think the interesting thing about Jordan and how I feel about his video, and Jordan and I actually had an opportunity to talk at length before I wrote the Walsh article, and he sails really close to things that I think people can relate to. And I think that we all want to have, an open discourse. We want conversations to flow. We want people to feel like if they have something to say, if they have a question, they can ask it, that they're not going to be censored. But he sails really close and then right past it, and that's where he and I part ways. Because what I don't really understand is when you listen to the video, he puts a lot of things into the basket of using the pronouns that people want. And it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of his anxieties, and he talks about being fearful and anxious in the video, that somehow there's a cabal of trans activists who have so much power that they are going to basically using the pronouns that people want and capitulating to these demands sort of pulls out the Jenga, the critical Jenga piece of the Western canon, right? I mean, basically, Jordan is arguing that this is going to create chaos and anarchy, and it's essentially a Marxist law that is there to sow violence and there to sow confusion and topple any kind of hierarchy.
Can I just jump in there for a second? Is that an accurate characterization?
I listened really closely to that tape. I think it is.
In your view, has she accurately characterized where you're coming from?
It's not a transsexual cabal by any stretch of the imagination. Is it a cabal of radical left-wingers? Yes, it's a cabal of radical left-wingers, and they've been active behind and in front of the scenes increasingly over the last 30 years. And my estimation is that departments like Women's Studies have trained between 300,000 and 3 million radical left-wing activists, and they're making...
And they're all underpaid, so don't worry.
Well, they could pick higher-paying occupations if they wanted higher-paying occupations, but...
Because sexism does not exist. Are you kidding me?
Let's not get off topic here, folks.
I think we're directly on point.
Mary, come on back.
So I think Jordan has conceded that I think I grasped his concern. At the very least, I grasped the concern, and that there is a kind of chipping away at order as we come to know it. The other thing that Jordan and I have in common is a real interest in language, and the idea of what can happen when language changes, when it evolves. I was thinking, before I came here, I was thinking about, I grew up in the Bronx, and I was born in '61, so I remember very well when we went from Mrs. to Ms., and my father was appalled, and he kept saying Ms., and he thought that was funny, because if you couldn't actually identify somebody as either, particularly a female, as either married or single, then
The notion
chaos,
the
right?
notion of characterizing a woman independent of her marital
That's
status
right,
is
and
controversial at the time.
apparently very, very confusing. And so I'm reminded of that when the suggestion is made that somehow if we have words that don't fit into something that we're very familiar with and that we've used to date, that chaos will ensue, that everyone will be confused. I don't believe that. There's no evidence of that historically.
I hear you, but there was no law obliging people to use the word
Actually,
Ms.
but there were laws to oblige people to change the way that we referred to black people, for example. There was a time when there were any number of words that we now can only say as letters. Can I say them on TVO? People were called darkies, niggers, coons, in polite company. And that evolved. Those things changed. When I was a teenager, people were still using those words.
So this is a natural evolution in your view?
This is a natural evolution, and chaos will not ensue.
Evolution, then we don't need hate speech law to enforce it.
But we do, because we can drive social change, and it doesn't all have to lead to chaos, is my point. And I think that, we have seen the flip side of Jordan's argument, I think, has in fact, we do have a historical record. So when it was left to others to name people, we lost Indigenous names. My mother's from Ireland. She was from a generation that finally got to learn her own language again. She couldn't even speak Gaelic to her parents because they hadn't been allowed to speak it. So we've seen the effect when people can't use their own language, when they can't use their own names.
Okay, let me get Jordan to respond to that. A natural evolution of things, Jordan. That's how it's being described.
Words are tools. Maybe that was one of the great philosophical discoveries of the 20th century. And that means, and people are always looking for new tools to operate in the world. And if you invent a good tool, like a new word, then people will pick it up just as fast as they possibly can. You really see that in English. But the words that are being required now are not good tools, and that's why people aren't using them. And so instead what we have is the use of force, despite the fact that that's being denied. Although we've already established that, at least in the opinion of one of the people on this panel, I'm already guilty of a hate crime, which is what I said I was guilty of when I made that video. Steve, the issue with the law is quite straightforward. The government is requiring us to use certain language. That's not the same as not using certain language. And it's a line, and this is the fundamental issue. This is maybe the fundamental issue. That's a line we should not cross. We should not allow the government to decide which words we're allowed to use. It's a mistake, and it's a mistake that strikes right at the heart of free speech. And the thing about free speech is that it's not the right to criticize your leaders, which is what people usually characterize it as. Is freedom of speech is freedom to engage in the processes that we use to formulate the problems in our society, to generate solutions to them and reach a consensus. It's actually a mechanism. It's not just a value. And you should use constraints on free speech with the most extreme caution, because you interfere with people's ability to think and communicate.
Let me get Theron to weigh in. Theron, you've been hearing the debate here in the studio. Why don't you weigh in and pick it up?
Well, I guess I'm in the same boat as Dr. Peterson when it comes to being guilty of a hate crime, or a hate speech infringement, because, I draw the line somewhere. For example, I refuse to use pronouns like sie, them, their. I don't have a problem using they, them, their pronouns, and that also happens just to be because of the circles in which I move. I happen to know people who use gender-neutral pronouns, who I've gotten used to it. But the vast majority of people are not going to come into contact with the incredibly small fraction of the population of gender non-binary people, and that's why this is never really going to pick up, in my opinion. When it comes to Mrs. and Ms., at least half of the population is female, so there was some interaction with the term Mrs. versus Ms. And there were some interactions so people could pick it up. There just aren't enough gender non-binary. I use that in quotation marks because I hate that term, because it's a political term, not a gender identity or a term of identification. Regardless, I don't think it's going to pick up. There's just not enough of these people to interact with.
The Twitter sphere has been buzzing with this conversation, and let's just pull one up here. Let's pull up one tweet. This was tweeted to a number of people, including, as you can see in the middle, Jordan B. Peterson, who's on our program tonight. I so look forward to Bill C-16 putting your kind of silly trolling to an end, it says. There are people, let's go to our Professor Kyle in Ottawa. There are people out there who hope that C-16 lives up to Jordan's worst fears. Do you agree that C-16 ought to be able to prevent people from expressing negative opinions about transgender people?
So first I want to clarify that Bill C-16 only applies to federally regulated entities. So for example, the University of Toronto is under provincial jurisdiction, so is therefore subject to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So I think that's an important point to note. I also want to note there's been a lot of talk about the hate crimes. That seems to be like kind of an American import into our discussion. The only two changes that this Bill C-16 make are to make minor amendments to Section 318 and 718 of the Criminal Code. The first is advocating genocide, as I've talked about, a very, very extreme high standard. And then second off, at sentencing, after an offense has been committed and a person has been found guilty, what 718 does is it tells judges that they ought to treat hate motivation as an aggravating factor at sentencing, to treat that as a more severe form. And currently we have a series of identities that are set out in 718, things like sexual orientation, race. We don't have currently gender identity and gender expression there, and so that's what this do. So I just want to make it very clear that we ought not to be importing American concepts into the discussion here. And so to the extent that Bill C-16 makes changes, only to, in the Canadian Human Rights Act context, to federally regulated entities, which is not the University of Toronto.
Nicholas, let me follow up with you. Why, in your view, do you think the trans community needs this kind of legislative protection?
Well, thank you. That's basically the point that hasn't been raised yet, which is that people are actually suffering huge lack of access to resources that will allow people to survive. So people are being physically assaulted. People do not have counselors that they can go to who are not going to, as Dr. Peterson has done on YouTube, recommend that they actually become more anxious and more upset about situations. People are being assaulted. I brought all sorts of really depressing stats that people who are leaning towards thinking that this is not that big of a deal, those people need to look at those stats. But
Give us one stat.
Yeah, so 58% of students could not get academic transcripts with their correct name or pronoun. That causes a huge chain of events for students or anybody who's had any kind of academic training. As everyone recognizes, we need to be able to have references, we need to be able to have resumes, we need to be able to get jobs.
So I want to be sure that I'm clearly understanding your point here, which is, and therefore they feel disrespected, and therefore this affects their life in a very real way. Is that right?
The feeling of disrespect is not as important as the ways that people in authority are able to circumvent the possibilities for living. So it has more to do with not being able to find housing and therefore being homeless, has more to do with not being able to get jobs because people are discriminated against. So we're not actually talking, we shouldn't be talking about free speech. What we should be talking about are the social issues facing people who are being discriminated against and what that looks like on campus, which is that some professors refuse to offer basic dignity to students and colleagues. And that leads to people missing classes, it leads to people dropping out, it leads to a lack of positive opportunity for society to actually benefit from the contributions of many, many people. And I also don't teach that there's a huge divide between trans people and non-trans people, because I would say the number is 100% of people will benefit from more open discussion. And one of the problems is that it's being addressed in a black and white way. So it's too bad that we can't actually have an open conversation because there's a huge wall of violence between us.
Here is somebody who did not share your view on that, because we invited another guest to be on the program today, and this person initially said yes, and then sent a Facebook message to our producer, Vladek Shemberg, saying, you know what, changed my mind, giving Jordan Peterson this platform serves to legitimize his views, which are based in bigotry and misinformation. The humanity and rights of transgender, non-binary, and intersex people are not a matter of debate, and holding a debate which would cause equivalency between the views expressed by Peterson and the human rights concerns of the trans community would be an act of transphobia. Therefore, none of us should participate in this. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. It's a very important perspective.
That's why I'm matter of debate, and holding a debate which places a false equivalency between the views expressed by Peters.
An open conversation
Here's
because
somebody
there's a
who-
huge
here's
wall of
somebody-
violence between us.
Here is somebody who did not share your view on that because we invited another guest to be on the program today, and this person initially said yes, and then sent a Facebook message to our producer, Vladek Shembrek, saying, you know what, changed my mind. Giving Jordan Peterson this platform serves to legitimize his views, which are based in bigotry and misinformation. The humanity and rights of transgender, non-binary, and intersex people are not a matter of debate, and holding a debate which places a false equivalency between the views expressed by Peterson and the human rights concerns of the trans community would be an act of transphobia. Therefore, none of us wish to participate in this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for reading that. It's a very important topic.
That's why I read it. I wonder whether, Jordan, everybody's talking past each other here. You are trying to make a point about free speech. The other side,
We're talking past each other.
well, but the others, you're trying to make a point about free speech. The other side is trying to make a point about the rights, the human rights of trans people. That's not the point that you're trying to make. Do we have two different groups here that are trying to make two different points, and they find themselves in the same bowl of soup, and that's why this has turned into the conflagration it has?
Well, it's partly that because the issues we're discussing have to center around some actual issues, and they have to center around the issue surrounding transgender language. But I don't think we're talking past each other at all in a fundamental sense. I mean, I think that the real problem here is that there's a concerted attempt being made by many people to subvert all the values to the value of equality of outcome. And we need more than one value, first of all, if we're going to survive as a society, because you can't solve every problem with the same approach. But there are more insidious things, in my estimation, going on underneath. I mean, even the missive that you just read said that, well, even providing me with a platform, let's call it, to express my views, is something that should be allowed. Yes, that's why I made the video like this, because many people are claiming that the expression of these sorts of views should no longer be permitted. And it's this view for now, but this is a minor issue in some ways compared to the larger issue that's at stake, which is our right to have discussions of this sort. I mean, one thing that happened right when we started this was that there was an initial claim, for example, that there's no such thing as biological sex. Well, I believe quite firmly that if we continue on this path, that's a discussion we will not actually be able to have on campuses. Because by fiat, I mean, the legislation already implicitly presumes that biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression, which we haven't even talked about yet, vary independently. That is simply not true.
Theron, the person who sent that Facebook message thinks that we're partaking in transphobia just by having this debate. I hope that's not the case. But I wonder if you could give us your explanation for why some people adamantly refuse even to have this discussion, that the notion of having this discussion is somehow transphobic.
I think it has to do with there's a lacking when it comes to actually being able to defend your argument. So if you open up the discussion for they know they will lose. I think it's absolutely ludicrous and insane to say that having this discussion is by default transphobic. I think it's even more it's equally ludicrous to call Dr. Peterson what he said transphobic. I think it takes, using that term so willy-nilly, it takes the emotional response to a term like transphobia and connotates it with something, in my opinion, productive and having a discussion. And I think that's very insidious, and I think that's very manipulative.
Kyle, are we being transphobic here by having this debate?
Well, I do worry about setting up a false equivalency in this conversation, and really even making the premise that trans lives are up for debate. They're not up for debate. Human rights aren't up for debate. And the reason that I agreed to be on the program is that I've been very troubled by the misinformation about what the law is actually going to do. And so I really grappled with whether or not I wanted to participate in this discussion. But I thought it was very important to really try to dial back the hateful rhetoric and actually do a very careful discussion about what the law is actually designed to achieve, and ultimately to promote a more equitable and just society. So we've talked about freedom of expression, to use the Canadian term, but we should also be talking about other values like equality and anti-racism, I think.
Just curious, Mary, I'm going to get to you in 1 sec. I am curious, though. You've now participated in 90% of the program. We're just about done. Was it a good idea for you to come on?
I think that it's an opportunity to try to work through some of the legal issues, the social and human rights and equality issues, and so I'm happy to be here, but I recognize that other people's experiences, they might find ultimately that participating in this program was a mistake.
Mary,
Well, I certainly want to say that Kyle, I found that what you brought to it in terms of putting the bill into perspective actually really helpful and probably helpful to a lot of people. So I'm glad that Kyle was here. I think for me, one of the things that I felt anxious about coming in, and I'm still puzzling over why this issue. Why this issue? So, and I do think, at the risk of bringing in the United States again, there does seem to be a similarity between some of the rhetoric we're hearing down south right now through the election and this. It feels like it's greatly exaggerated. Sort of what can fall out from this, and we're sort of, it feels like a bit of a tempest in a tea. I don't see the connections that Jordan is making, and as a person who identifies as transgender, it's very, very confusing that this is somehow up for discussion.
You saw the tape at the beginning of the program I mean, he tried to give a speech at a university campus and was really quite mercilessly shouted down.
And that would be one of the places where Jordan and I would have some common ground in that there has been a trend in some ways for people to allow no platform, and this person's views are objectionable and we don't want them to come on the campus.
What do you think of that?
I think it's probably best not discussed in the context of someone's personal identity. Right? So that's part of what I'm bothered by this discussion. So
Yeah, discussion about speech on the university campus. I think you can't have that because that's supposed to be where they have it.
I agree with you. I think that is a problem. What I'm trying to say is that, those issues came up around issues of someone who was pro-Israel who wanted to come onto a campus. Those things are political. My identity, my personal identity, my gender identity is very separate from my political identity. And so it's very strange to have this to be where we're going to plant the flag and say, enough with this crazy political correctness. You don't get to choose your pronouns. It seems trivial to me.
I thought it was an axiom, say, of feminism, for example, that the personal was political. And isn't that that's a famous phrase, the personal is political.
Okay, but still is political when someone is attacking you on a basis that is personal and that you can't change about yourself. That is political. And that's when people sometimes become politicized, is when they realize that no matter what they do in the world, there will be people who will continue to attack them on racist grounds, on gender and sexual violence grounds. And that's why people start to fight back, and that's why people object.
And your attempts to regulate my language use and
I don't care about your language use. I care about the safety of the people who are being harmed.
I know people who make your kinds of arguments are always concerned with other people's safety.
I'm concerned with my own safety. Just so that people are aware, my physical, emotional life and livelihood is at risk from being here. I don't know about you, because I don't live your life. I do know that you're here and that's one of the major ways that you're able to do this. But I just want people to be aware that trans and gender diverse communities, and especially people of color, are being targeted and threatened physically. So free speech is a great idea, and equality is a great idea, but we actually can't have those conversations when people are fighting people.
Let me read this tweet to you, and I'll mention this because I think it's instructive of the conversation that just took place between the two of you. Can someone please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence? Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on. That wasn't the question.
It's true.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on strike. I'm not doing this. That's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially when they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, And that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns. Then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization. That's what I believe.
Do you have tenure?
I do. And
So they can't fire you for this?
well, it's not all that easy to figure out what people can and can't do. If I'm, certainly they could fire me if I was, let's say, if the hate speech allegation, so to speak, stuck. I mean, the university's been quite reasonable about this, especially compared to many universities. We're going to have a debate.
I was just going to say, we got a minute left, and I do want to give it to Jordan, because the university has not said entirely, shut up, we don't want to hear this anymore.
No, but I went and talked to the dean on Friday, and I sat down with my family, and I thought, okay, what would be the best way for this to go for everyone? For me, and for my students, and for the university, and for society. I thought, okay, well, really, obviously there's an issue here, several of them, because otherwise all of this noise wouldn't have emerged. So we should actually have a debate about it.
And that's happening.
Yes, so I went and talked to the dean, David Cameron, who was a very reasonable person, and I said, look, well, I think the University of Toronto should take a leadership position on this, and there's issues to be discussed here.
So who are you debating?
Well, that remains to be seen. I haven't seen people flooding out of the woodwork to debate me so
Do we have
far.
a date, place, and time yet?
We don't. It'll be on the campus. It'll probably be on a morning in the next 2 weeks.
And let me know, we'll tweet it
I
out
will
there.
let you know, absolutely.
Okay, that's our time, I'm afraid, everybody. I do want to thank everybody for coming in tonight, and I hope you found it was worth your while. We certainly found it, I think, a very useful exercise.
For people,
Sorry?
people who just watch this program maybe really need of some
Sure,
help.
you have a website?
Yeah, I would really encourage people to go to transformingjustice.ca. It's a current research initiative that will appeal to anyone with any interest in research and learning.
Say it again, transformingjustice.ca.
Transformingjustice.ca.
We're happy to put that out there.
Thank you.
Theron Meyer, the transpondent and YouTuber in Vancouver, Kyle Kirkup, the professor of law at University of Ottawa. We thank everyone for being outside our studio, but part of our broadcast tonight. Jordan Peterson at the U of T, Nick Matt at the U of T, Mary Rogan. You can read more about this in her piece, Growing Up Trans, in the October issue of Walrus Magazine, on Better Bookstore and corner store stands everywhere. Thanks so much, everybody.
Help GBO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit GBO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.
Your arm has never been more powerful. It can save lives, lift your community. You have the power to finish this. Vaccination appointments are available today, so get yours and get us back to us. Find the vaccine at pa.gov/COVID. Pay for with Pennsylvania taxpayer dollars.
People said I wouldn't play in college. They said I wouldn't go pro. But my family and community always had my back. That's why I partner with Optimum Nutrition. Join us as we build better lives.
Pike's Peak. Named after Zebulon Pike, who never made it to the top. Of course, you didn't notice a Dan from our sport-tuned GT lineup. Well, Zebulon, this one's for you. Right now, lease a new 2022 K5 LXS for $189 a month.
Well, I think the way that Piers talks about specifically non-binary people is that you mock them, you make fun of them, you use them as entertainment, you use the lives of real people in this country, a vulnerable minority, as something to make fun of and get a reaction. And I don't think that's the quality journalism
When has
that
he
you do
done
elsewhere.
that?
Well,
Be
for example,
specific,
well, when you claim that you're a two-spirit penguin.
Yeah, you know why I did that? Because you and I had this debate about